August 1950. You would hope that the worst conflict in human history that ended only 5 years ago would have taught us something about restraint and decency in wartime. But that is not what it looks like in Korea, where only 5 years after World War II ended, already from the start, the war is fought with the utmost brutality and disregard for human decency. Since the World War ended, the terms crimes against humanity, genocide, and universal human rights have been headlining world debate on how to make armed conflict less atrocious. Spearheaded by the United Nations, one of the belligerents in the war now raging in Korea, new laws have been introduced meant to limit human suffering and further rein in armed forces and regimes in conflict. But now, barely a year after the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 3 years after the Nuremberg Protocols, and while the hunt for Axis war criminals continues, it is the side of the United Nations who become the perpetrators of mass murder and aid and abet democide in South Korea. This is a special episode of War Against Humanity in our Korean War in Real Time series. I am Spartacus, Olsson. Korea is like any other war in some regards. It spells terror and disaster for civilians across the whole Korean peninsula, north and south alike. This series will shine a light on war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the human tragedies during the Korean War in real time, covering the humanitarian calamity that runs side by side with the military conflict. For now, it will come out irregularly to cover the events alongside Indy's Korean War Weekly episodes. This episode will cover the period from June 25th to August 15th, 1950. Now, with no further ado, let us begin. Pretty much with the first shots fired in the Korean War on June 25, 1950, the laws of war are already thrown out the window and the first atrocities committed. On the day the war begins, the Security Bureau of the Ministry of Internal Affairs of South Korea sends out a memorandum to all provincial police stations across the nation. It reads, "Crackdown on blacklisted persons and security of prisons across the nation. Detain all blacklisted people nationwide." Similar orders will follow on June 29th, 30th, and July 11th, all providing a directive on arresting the members of the National Guidance Alliance and other political dissidents and detaining them in prisons until further notice from the Security Bureau. These blacklisted individuals are members or associates of the Kukmin Bodoyan Meng, the National Guidance Alliance, or the Bodo League, as well as the Workers' Party of South Korea, colloquially referred to as the Namro Party, and other smaller left-leaning organizations. The Bodo League is of special significance for the events to come. It is an official nationwide group formed by Syngman Rhee's government in 1949 to collect and re-educate people who had joined communist or socialist groups in the past or even just participated in assemblies by the left. To some degree, joining was voluntary, but many, if not most, were coerced into joining. As the war breaks out, some 300,000 people have applied or been applied for Bodo League membership. In effect, this gives the Rhee regime a comprehensive list of potential leftists in South Korea. These preventative arrests are only a first step. On June 27th, another order, this time from Syngman Rhee personally, is distributed to law enforcement agencies across the South. Execute those affiliated with the South Korean Labor Party or the Bodo League. The premeditated, systematic slaughter of suspected enemies of the state on a nationwide scale follows suit in July, August, and September, escalating into a true democide. The speed with which these executions are carried out is partly explained by the fact that as the North Korean army, the KPA, gains more and more ground in these first 2 months of the war, in the eyes of Syngman Rhee's regime, it is crucial that potential collaborators are captured and killed before their villages, towns, and cities fall into the hands of the enemy. At 3 p.m. local time on August 10th, Sergeant First Class Frank Pierce witnesses one of the countless such executions taking place across the South and reports it to his superiors. While on a routine patrol on the highway between Daegu and Waegwan, he stops his jeep to investigate a large volume of gunfire. This gunfire comes from a canyon near the top of a mountain that is situated approximately 8 miles north of Tegu. There, at the top of the mountain, near the edge of a cliff, 200 to 300 prisoners have been gathered. It seems to be civilians, including some women and at least one girl, which he judges to be 12 to 13 years old. All readied for execution, they are tied together in pairs of two, with their hands tied so tightly that there are cries of severe pain coming from the prisoners. Extreme cruelty was noted from the military policemen to the condemned persons, such as striking them on the head with gun butts and kicking them in the body for no reason. While the rest are witnessing the executions, 20 prisoners are taken at a time and placed facing out over the cliff. Behind each of the victims was placed one military policeman. At the command of fire, the military police fired at the head of the prisoner that was in front of him. It was noted in several of the shootings that due to poor aim of the weapon, the prisoner was not killed instantly, but it was necessary for several other shots to be fired into the body of the victim, and in some cases the mercy shot was not administered, and at about 3 hours after the executions were completed, some of the condemned persons were still alive and moaning. The cries could be heard coming from somewhere in the mass of bodies piled in the canyon. When Pierce inquires why these people are executed, the commander of the military police unit, a captain of the South Korean army, replies curtly that the prisoners are killed because they are spies. Nothing more of an explanation is given. Pierce's report and many others describing similar events make their way up the U.S. chain of command. 8 days after Pierce's report is filed, Lieutenant General Walton Walker, commanding general of all troops in Korea, sends a letter to John Muccio, American ambassador in Daegu. My dear Mr. Ambassador, I am enclosing herewith copies of documents concerning executions allegedly by agencies of the Republic of Korea. General MacArthur has directed that I present this matter to you for consideration and such action as you deem appropriate. Thus, the American High Command, all the way up to General MacArthur, know about these incidents at the very latest in the days leading up to August 18th and inform the State Department. Yet no actions follow, and the U.S. silently condones the actions taken by Syngman Rhee and his regime. So the killing continues unopposed across any territory under the control of the South Korean army. Until the end of September, between 100 and 200,000 people will be executed, their bodies hidden in mass graves. Nearly all political prisoners, a large number of members of the Bodo League and other spies are among the victims. Spies infiltrating South Korean civilians fleeing the front lines are also a cause of concern for U.S. soldiers and pilots. As we have seen in Indy's coverage, during the first months of the war, the advancing KPA is pushing the South Korean and United Nations troops back further and further. However, the UN troops have unrivaled supremacy at sea and in the air. As soon as American air power arrives, it is put to use against the North Koreans whenever the weather allows. The 8th Fighter Bomber Group is amongst the first to engage the enemy in the skies and on the ground. However, the pilots are plagued by rumors going around all U.S. military forces at the time, as Alvin Wimmer, an F-80 pilot, explains. In the war's first weeks, rumors about infiltrators dressed in white were floating around our operations ready room. White is the usual color of everyday clothing in Korea, and many civilians wear white. This leads to some unfortunate events. For instance, on July 20th, 4 F-80s of the 35th Fighter Bomber Squadron, 8th Fighter Bomber Group, Wayne, Donald, Stark, and Hall, take off at 9:10 a.m. towards Yusong, a district of the city of Daejeon. Upon their return to base in Japan, they report, some people in white clothes were strafed 3 to 4 miles south of Yusong. Controllers said to fire on people in white clothes. We're about 50 in group. Number hit unknown. On the same day, a later sortie, also conducted by the 35th Fighter Bomber Squadron, reports similar events. Many troops seen in river areas directly south of Hwaesong could have been refugees because much baggage was seen piled on riverbanks, were strafed by order of controller. Number of people hit unknown. Because of the relentless push forward by the North Koreans, hundreds of thousands of civilians are streaming southward away from the front lines. Moreover, given the chaotic fighting in this opening phase of the war, they are often overtaken by enemy forces and not always ahead of enemy lines. It is quite certain that these groups of people in white, strafed on the 20th as well as before and after by the Air Force, are not enemy troops, nor to any meaningful degree covert North Korean operatives posing as civilians. They are just civilians. The Air Force acknowledges this in a memo to General Edward Timberlake, currently the Vice Commander of the 5th Air Force, on July 25, 1950. Subject: Policy on strafing refugees. The problem: 1. To determine the policy for guidance of all 5th Air Force units in regard to strafing of civilian refugees on the highways. Facts bearing on the problem. 2. It is reported that large groups of civilians, either composed of or controlled by North Korean soldiers, are infiltrating U.S. positions. 3. The Army has requested that we strafe all civilian refugee parties that are noted approaching our positions. 4. To date, we have complied with the Army's request in this respect. Discussion. Our operations involving the strafing of civilians is sure to receive wide publicity and may cause embarrassment to the U.S. Air Force and to the U.S. government in its relation with the United Nations. Recommendations. 7. For the protection of the Air Force, it is recommended that a policy be established whereby 5th Air Force aircraft will not attack civilian refugees unless they are definitely known to contain North Korean soldiers or commit hostile acts. 8. It is further recommended that we so inform 8th Army Headquarters, Turner C. Rogers, Colonel, USAF. For the pilots, other factors make it more challenging to discern civilians from combatants. You can identify and perceive the difference between combatants and non-combatants more readily when you are on the ground in closer proximity than at 3,000 or 4,000 feet at 500 miles per hour. Added to this issue is the fact that because the F-80s are fuel-guzzling machines taking off in Japan, they have mere minutes in the area of operation and have to rely entirely on their spotters in slower prop-driven planes nicknamed mosquitoes. These controllers have to coordinate as many as 13 planes at once, and as a result are themselves overwhelmed, leading to bad calls. It is unclear how many civilians are killed by these air attacks, but it is certainly in the thousands. As I mentioned, it is the U.S. Army that asks the Air Force to strafe the suspected North Korean infiltrators in white. Soon, the Army's fear of infiltrators also leads to a humanitarian catastrophe. On July 26, one day after the Air Force memo is sent, the 2nd Battalion of the 7th Cavalry Regiment of the 1st Cavalry Division is dug in around Syngman Rhee, a hamlet 100 miles southeast of Seoul. As Indy has mentioned multiple times in the weekly series, these troops are greener than spring grass in Ireland, with little to no combat discipline. They have been shaken to the core by their first combat experiences and now anxiously sit in their new dugouts. At the same time, a group of refugees is coming southward, led by ox carts piled with personal belongings. These people are from a nearby village and have evacuated following warnings by American GIs that the North Koreans are approaching. The killing begins when F-80 planes dive out of the sky and strafe the refugees. However, there is at least the possibility that this specific strafing is an honest mistake, since the company commander has allegedly called for an airstrike miles up the road from the refugees' position. In any case, the refugees slowly approached the 2nd Battalion along a railroad track leading south. An Associated Press special report from the year 2000 will say that on that morning, the U.S. 8th Army radioed orders throughout the Korean front that began, no refugees will be permitted to cross battle lines at any time. And 2 days prior, on the 24th, 1st Cavalry Headquarters had given more explicit orders. No refugee to cross the front line. Fire everyone trying to cross line. Use discretion in case of women and children. As the refugees meet the 2nd Battalion, the Americans open fire. Yet, luckily, Lieutenant Robert Carroll recognizes that these are not enemy forces and orders his companies to cease fire, and will later comment that an order to fire on civilians is patently an illegal order. The lieutenant then shepherds the boy to safety under a double-arch concrete railroad bridge nearby, where, shaken and wounded, Koreans are gathered. He will report seeing no enemy combatants or infiltrators. There weren't any North Koreans in there the first day, I'll tell you that. It was mainly women and kids and old men. Lieutenant Carroll then leaves the scene, and the other officers do not share his opinion that these Koreans are civilians. As the sun goes down on July 26, Captain Melbourne Chandler orders the machine gunners of his heavy weapons company to set up at the mouths of the tunnel, reportedly stating, "The hell with all those people, let's get rid of all of them." At around 10 p.m., machine gun muzzle flashes light up the night from both sides of the tunnel, mercilessly firing into the 300 or so Korean civilians sheltering there. The first to collapse with blood streaming from numerous bullet holes are those near the entrance on either side. Chung Kwo-ho, an 11-year-old girl at the time, will recall. People pulled dead bodies around them for protection. Mothers wrapped their children with blankets and hugged them with the backs towards the entrances. My mother died on the second day of shooting. The 2nd Battalion continues to hold their positions, aiming at the tunnel for 4 days and 3 nights. Some trapped refugees managed to slip away, but others were shot as they tried to escape or crawled out to find clean water to drink, report the mere 24 Korean survivors. Machine gunner Norman Tinkler will remark, "We just annihilated them." There is some debate as to whether there were shots fired at the American soldiers from the group of refugees, although there are more testimonies that state that there were none. One potential explanation for this apparent contradiction is that the Americans were misinterpreting their fire ricocheting through some of the tunnel's opposite ends. Another cause for controversy is whether or not enemy combatants are found in the pile of corpses once the slaughter ends sometime on July 29th. Once again, there are conflicting testimonies, with the majority agreeing that no such bodies were found. The same goes for weapons hidden by the civilians. I should also mention that while some members of the 2nd shoot the refugees without a second thought, others refuse to shoot or deliberately miss, such as Delos Flint, who will say that some of us did and some of us didn't, and machine gunner James Kearns, who reportedly fired over the heads of the people huddled together under the bridge and will claim that "I would not fire into a bunch of women." After the 7th Cavalry retreats later on during the morning of the 29th, the North Koreans find the site of the massacre. The Northern press immediately seizes this opportunity to demonize the South Korean and American forces, and in this specific instance, propaganda press or not, they may be straight on the money. That said, the North Koreans have their own acts of callousness and cruelty to account for in these first months of the war. Once Kim Il-sung's KPA takes hold of a territory, in their mind it will stay in their hands forever. After all, this is the whole motivation behind the conflict, to unify Korea under the one true Korean government of Kim Il-sung in the north. To ensure the perpetuity of their project, opponents need to be removed from the equation and reforms initiated to transform the authoritarian capitalist system of the South into the authoritarian communist utopia of the North. First, like in the South, the KPA and connected North Korean intelligence agencies seek out political dissidents, or what historian Charles Armstrong will describe they think to be traitors to the Korean nation, such as former Japanese collaborators, high-ranking members of the Rhee regime, the national police, members of right-wing youth groups, and the like. The very highest-ranking members of such organizations, however, are imprisoned rather than executed, at least for now. Yet, the killing of real or perceived traitors to the nation happens on a much smaller scale than in the South, and for a reason. The North Koreans explicitly want to avoid brutally abusing the populations to make permanent incorporation of said population easier. That is why clear orders are given to prevent such things from occurring, as one order to the occupation security forces illustrates. Discipline and order should be strictly observed, never be offensive or bureaucratic towards the people, and do not infringe on the people's rights. And the North Korean soldiers stick to their orders. Even those who had most reason to hate the forces from the North typically reported their conduct courteous and reasonable. Overall, the reforms the North strives for are met with largely positive reactions for now, and land reform, equal rights for women, and Korean unification seem to have made the greatest impression. All in all, it can be said that at this point, the KPA occupation of Seoul and large part of South Korea was far from a reign of terror. While terror might not blatantly reign in the occupied territory, it certainly does so on the battlefield and among captured UN soldiers. Since the very first days of the war, UN forces know that being captured by the Northern forces means one of two things: immediate death or prolonged agony under the torture and then death. This fear is so entrenched in the young and raw American recruits that some even choose suicide by grenade rather than risk capture. Only if the Northerners believe someone holds valuable information or can be of use in some other way are they taken in for questioning. Once they have outlived their purpose, they are quickly disposed of. There is no room for mercy even towards those unable to fight, at least in the minds of the KPA. On July 17th, the U.S. troops are once more forced to retreat from the seemingly unstoppable advance of the North Korean army and their T-34s, abandoning their positions around Daejeon. If you want to know more about the exact military situation on the ground, check out Indy's episode from that week. Among the 100 are about 30 wounded soldiers, Chaplain Herman Fellholter, and the regimental medical officer, Captain Linton Buttry. With the KPA getting ever closer to their resting site atop one of the hills, the officers make a tough call. The wounded are to be left behind. Fellholter and Buttry volunteer to stay behind with the wounded, tending to them as best they can, hoping that once another group of American troops comes by, the wounded could be taken along. But the next group to climb the hill is not American or South Korean, but from the KPA. Sometime after 9 p.m., they stumble upon the camp of the wounded with Fellholter and Buttry wearing the Latin Cross and medical brassards, neither of them armed. The Geneva Convention from 1949 states that chaplains and medical personnel shall be respected and protected in all circumstances. The KPA forces do not adhere to the Geneva Convention and slaughter the 30 wounded soldiers, the chaplain, and the medic. 3 of the bodies, including that of Father Fellholter, can be retrieved later in the chaos and tumult of the battle by other Americans. Similar events occur frequently in these first weeks and months of the Korean War, like at Bloody Gulch when U.S. prisoners of war are brutally cut down, or at Hill 303 where on August 14th, 26 American soldiers from H Mortar Platoon are taken prisoners, and 3 days later, on the 17th, together with another 19 U.S. prisoners at the crest of a ravine, prostrate, with their hands tied, will be shot in the back of the head, much like the South Korean civilians from the beginning of the video. Survival during North Korean captivity is another kind of hell. Ed Slater from the 21st Infantry Regiment is captured in the very first weeks of the war as part of Task Force Smith, sent into battle near Olsson on 5th of July. He is separated from other American forces, and after 11 days on the run without food and very little water, he is captured while eating rice in a nearby village. Here's his account of what follows. They picked me up and told me to eat more rice. I told them I could not eat any more. One crammed rice into my mouth. They laughed a lot while doing it. Then I vomited, some of which landed on one of them. They dragged me out into the open and tied my hands behind me. I believe I had seen my last sunrise. I had seen some of our men with their hands tied behind them shot in the head. They then took turns hitting and kicking me. It seemed like there was no place they didn't hit. They even stomped on my feet. Suddenly, an officer appeared and began asking me, "Where's your radio?" Every time I shrugged or said something, he would hit me across the back with a club. Finally, I passed out. When I woke up, I was lying next to a freshly dug grave. Another officer asked the same questions over and over again. "Where did you leave your radio? Why did MacArthur send you over here? Are the Japanese coming over here? What is your rank?" He finally said he would have his men shoot me if I refused to answer his questions. At this point, I was so beat up that I really didn't care. They stood me at one end of the grave and pointed their rifles at me. Something hit me across the back, knocking me into the grave. I fell on my right shoulder and thought I broke it. As I moved, they started shooting around the top of the grave, laughing all the while. Ed Slater survives the ordeal and is liberated after 124 days of grueling captivity. His ordeal at the hands of the KPA is only one of many, some much longer than his. It seems like war never changes. The generals in command may differ, the theater of war may shift, and the things at stake may vary. But war means that people, innocent people, die. It is easy to glorify military actions and soldiers who go beyond the call of duty in the name of victory. At the same time, it is easy to forget and neglect the countless civilian victims and the ugly sides of war in our romanticized version of glorious combat that we engineer for posterity, in the form of a fable agreed upon, serving some ideological end, or just to make us feel less burdened by the acts of our nation. Yet the ugly, grueling, bone-chilling, and gut-wrenching aspects of war are precisely those that ought to be remembered most vividly and most clearly as a reminder for us that there is no glory or honor to be found in war, just death and despair. Never forget.